After playing through Castlevania for the NES, I wanted to compare it to Super Castlevania 4, a retelling of the Simon vs. Dracula battle in the first game. I found that they're really difficult to compare because the game design has gone in a completely different direction. In Castlevania, the levels and bosses are designed around the sub-weapons, but Super Castlevania 4 was created around the new whip mechanics added to this game. In this video, I will be recapping my very first playthrough of the game, along with how this new direction changes the game on the first playthrough and on repeat playthroughs. The game starts by having Simon enter through the drawbridge. On the next screen, a gate rises, seemingly in response to Simon's presence, trying to keep him out. This brings up one reason that I think Konami wanted to retell Simon's story instead of continuing it. This is to take advantage of the Super Nintendo hardware. This game brings a new spectacle to the series that couldn't be implemented before. While Simon has access to all of the whip mechanics right up front, they are not required to progress through stage 1. For example, like having a switch out of reach until Simon whips upward. Instead, the tutorial is stretched out over the first 4 stages, but they do introduce a new mechanic, the grapple point, here, first in a safe place that Simon can experiment with, before requiring the grapple point to move forward. There is a boss at the end of level 1, but he poses little threat and I defeated him on my first try. Stage 2 includes a disappointing mid-boss that I cleared on my very first attempt. My only death in this stage was learning that spikes in this game will kill you instantly, so I needed to be more careful around them. But honestly, this stage just seemed like padding to me. Stage 3 was an introduction to enemies that are not a threat. In the first section, the bone pillars are not a problem, just walk up and whip them. But at this point in the game, the player is likely still learning about all the different uses of the whip, like taking out enemies in this first vertical section of the game. Enemies above or below Simon in the first game were impossible, but here the tables have turned if the player has figured out the tricks. I had some trouble with these birds while climbing the stairs. This caused me to experiment further and discover this limp whip technique that works wonders to clear them out. There's even a good boss fight, a twin-headed dragon that the player can use the tricks they just learned to defeat him. Now, stage 4 has everything. It starts with a platforming challenge to teach the player about Simon's controls. I needed to figure out that Simon could immediately jump again when he lands to cross this gap. This is important to note and will help in later parts of the game. Next, there is a challenging boss fight that requires the player to use the new whip mechanics to advance. This gross skull with a gnarly tongue got me to start thinking about how to use the whip to progress through boss fights. When Nasty Skull Guy here is hit, debris falls from the ceiling. I was just taking the hit when I should have been dealing with the issue. I finally started to whip upward at the debris. You can see it click in my mind right here.
Okay, I think I figured out the strategy.
Next we have more spectacle. When getting on this grapple point, the entire room starts to spin. This caught me off guard, but after you clear this challenge, in the next room, Simon appears to be traveling across a tower that is spinning around him. After that, Simon enters a section where parts of the floor are floating upward, requiring some quick thinking to avoid the traps. The boss is pretty flashy at the end, but I again beat him on my first attempt. Perhaps it was because stage 4 had everything, but stage 5 has nothing. It's just padding. There's nothing new or challenging in this level. There's not even a boss at the end. Just nothing. I didn't even lose a life on my first playthrough. Stage 6 sees Simon in the entrance hall where the first Castlevania game starts. Seeing this rendered in 16-bit was a treat for me since I had just finished playing the 8-bit version. This is followed up with giant swinging chandeliers, a great example of something that wasn't found in Castlevania for the NES, a platforming challenge. This would have been miserable with the fixed jump arc from the first game, but with the improved controls this becomes a treat on each playthrough. From here we are introduced to new enemies that travel around Simon, really hitting home that the player will need the skill to aim and whip in all directions to get through this game. This stage ends with a boss that rushes at the player, but leaves plenty of time to whack them before they whack you. Stage 7 also feels like padding, but not as bad as stage 5. Having a stage in the library of the castle is fun, and there's a boss at the end of this stage, but there's still little challenge to be found in this stage that is so far into the game. I did notice that this is the point where the game starts to get skimpy with the sub-weapons, nudging the player to lean on the whip if they have been using the sub-weapons previously. Stage 8 was the longest stage for me on my first playthrough because of all the spike traps. This turns into a platforming test for the player, and while it took me a long time to get through it, trial, error, and practice got me to the end. The Frankenstein monster at the end is easy, but I feel like this stage is allowed to have an easy boss. I found in other games like Mega Man 6, if the platforming leans more towards the difficult side, then having the boss fight lean towards the easy side makes for a better player experience. If Stage 8 was the platforming test, then Stage 9 is the whip test. At this point, the game almost stops presenting sub-weapons for Simon on the main path. To even get them, the player must cross multiple grapple points consecutively. The axe is the only one available, and the boss in this stage is a giant bat. Seems perfect, but if you try to use the axe on the bat, you will be in harm's way of the falling gold. So in the end, the whip is the better option in this boss fight. And I really like the gold motif with the platforms, enemies, and even the boss being made of gold. One of the better stages in the game for sure. Stage 10 is a vertical stage. Even though the player has done these before, the game introduces these new grapple points on conveyor belts to keep the player interested. Again, the disappointing part of the stage is the boss fight at the end. I was able to beat him taking no damage on my very first playthrough. Stage 11 is like two stages mushed together. The first one is the final platforming stage, ascending falling stairs while being chased by a death saw, then riding floating platforms while avoiding the spikes and the pits. It took a lot of practice, but I made it. The last part of the game is a boss rush with no sub-weapons provided to the player. Here we are at the very end of the game, and the final test is boss battles, whip only. This makes it more bewildering that the cross is provided for the fight with Dracula. This Dracula fight is so different from the one in Castlevania. I ended up beating Dracula in two ways. One, fully powered up with the cross after taking too long figuring out this invisible staircase. At full power, I just needed to keep crosses in the air and I could focus on learning Dracula's pattern. A big reason that cut down on the attempts needed for my first win included the health pickups provided to the player during the fight. After getting my first win, I went back and beat Dracula with the whip only. I was surprised to find that since I already knew the pattern and there are health pickups in the middle of the fight, it only took a bit of practice before I was able to get my whip-only victory on the books. Both times it was satisfying to watch Dracula burn away and see the ending cutscene with the castle sinking. Comparing Castlevania for the NES and Super Castlevania 4 can be really tricky because Super Castlevania 4 is not the next increment on what came before. Instead, it took the series in a different direction. It encapsulates the trend that video games were headed. Nowadays, we play through a game, we beat it, we put it back on the shelf, and we move to the next game. During the arcade and NES days, players would hone their skills at a game, chasing a high score or trying to find more secrets. I had more fun with Super Castlevania 4 on my first playthrough. There wasn't a large wall of difficulty that I ran into, and the game had that spectacle that kept me wowed through to the end. But upon repeat playthroughs, the shine of that spectacle wears off a bit, and all of the padding becomes more prevalent. This is likely because there is little change in how to play the game. The sub-weapons are provided, but they don't change the experience very much. There are no secrets to find, no new paths to explore, and no improvement to be made on bosses that I already beat on my first try in my first playthrough. When I want to revisit this tale of Simon vs. Dracula, I usually turn to the NES game. There's less padding, there's more variety on how I can play the different parts of the game, and the Dracula fight is more satisfying to win again and again because of the skill required to complete it. Both games are great for different reasons. I would recommend Super Castlevania 4 to new players to the series, but I would explain that Castlevania for the NES is built around the sub-weapons, and if they're stuck, then they likely need to utilize them in a different way to progress. This has been my first real dive into the Castlevania series. It has been really fun for me, and I look forward to visiting more Castlevania games in the future. Thank you for watching.